See, Billy, see her go, 40 buses in a row. Oh no, Billy, they's trucks. What is in them, cows and ducks? I mean, he was so human. That's the, and it's people, not the things, it's the people.
It's people, yes. Wow.
Well, you know where I am, you know what's
Yes,
here.
indeed, yes, indeed. I'm coming for the stories now. Because I'm writing the Bi-Centenary book. Wow.
And Hugh Sherman. I didn't mention his sense of humour. If you go down to the sink and read that round thing that's on, and that come out. Africa, again some of them from the Muslims across the road. Oh, I know what I want you to take. Shall I give you another cup of tea before you go?
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Oh, you say that.
Yeah,
I know you've got to go.
yes.
Oh,
You
he's
know,
lost his father. His brother.
the mother.
Yes. Yeah.
I left them all in the office when I was just.
Yeah. Those are from India.
Wow.
I had an aunt who went as a missionary to India in 1930, and she died in 1931.
Oh.
So India is special as well.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Well,
really, really appreciate it.
Well, I hope it's of some use. There's John Wesley up there, behind you.
Oh, yeah. My heart became strangely warm.
Yeah. No, my neighbours now, these are all, they're from Pakistan.
Okay.
They went. I mean, there's Haiti on the stairs, there's Wales on the stairs.
Wow. We'll just show that as flip.
Racism.
Wow, yeah.
Those are Clubland mugs. See there, Clubland.
Wow. When he received his MBE, that was signed by Walworth members.
There's another sheet of signatures somewhere, but that was all that we could put in the picture. Again, he didn't want it.
Those are,
which
Oh yeah, Mr. Owen was telling me about that.
well, he had this letter from the Queen
And
to say
he
that
says no going.
yes, he literally threw it into the waste bin. Well, I knew about it because Ernest had been to see me to get the details.
Yes.
And so I thought, well, what am I going to... I mean, I knew what he felt like, but I thought, how am I going to get him to not refuse to do anything? So then I had to then tell him, well, look, the church members want you to have it, and so you better go. Well, of course, he didn't fill in the form saying about any of these things at all. So they gave him the lowest honour.
Okay.
That was, but then they did give it to him, and then because of him, because of Vic as well, I got. No, it isn't everybody who's got these things, and I don't show them to everybody. But I got Maundy money from the Queen. Now,
Wow.
how did I get to come Maundy money from the Queen? Got a letter from Buckingham Palace, and I thought, oh, what have I done wrong?
Or done right.
Should I have sent Vic's MB? Because I don't know, these things are only things.
Yeah.
And then there was this letter to say that I had been nominated to receive the Maundy money from the Queen. And I couldn't understand, and that I would be getting another letter. So I had to wait and wait and wait, and eventually got a letter asking me to contact the bishop, the equivalent of a bishop in my church, which is the chairman of the district. So I phoned the chairman of the district and I said, I've had this letter from Buckingham Palace about Maundy money, and I don't understand it. I mean, there are thousands of people in Manchester who've lived, born and bred in Manchester. So he said, oh, thank goodness. It was the Dean of the Cathedral, Dean of Manchester Cathedral, who'd written to Keith Davis, the chairman of the district, to say that he was wanting to nominate me to have Maundy money. Well, Keith Davis didn't know. How did I know the Dean of the Cathedral? Because you do things and you don't talk about them. When we came here, having left Clubland, you can just imagine, fortunately, and I haven't mentioned this at all, we had 2 years in Holland, healing the churches in Holland. We came here in the August, in September, Vic went to Holland, and we were there backwards and forwards for 2 years. And then when he finished there, then it was starting to realise he was retired, and Manchester churches are no different from other churches. And it was hard to go to church on a Sunday, make no bones about it, it was hard. And then I heard that there was a fantastic organist at her local Anglican church. So I said to Vic one day, instead of going to the Methodist with all their arguing and their, it wasn't easy, why don't we go to Christ Church, just so that we can have some good music, which what we did. He didn't say who he was, we just were polite to everybody. And then about once a month we would go to Christ Church just to listen to the music. Then the vicar retired and they had an interim vicar. And then after 6 months they had a new vicar, Rogers Gwenda, a black man from South Africa. Well, there was no way Wick was going to close his mouth with a black vicar. And he went and told him who he was and said, if I can help you in any way. And he was doing work with race relations here in Manchester, even though he was retired. So he and Rogers Gwenda became great friends. And then very quickly, Rogers Gwenda was made Dean of the Cathedral. And at that time, Vic got ill with cancer, and so we weren't able to. And then when Roger got this notification to choose people from the Anglican Church to have Maundy money, he went and chose me as one of them. And that was how I got to get the Maundy money from them. So again, it's ordinary people doing ordinary things, getting extraordinary.
That's right. That's right.
of a British knighthood,
Okay.
and it had never been given to any
Foreigner.
foreigner
Hmm.
before. And then the Americans, not to be outdone, they gave him the master key to the Panama Canal. And he was dying to go and stick it in to see if he could muck up the works. But you see, both sides had recognised something in him, and he had been able to build bridges between them.
Great man.
Great man. Then the church wanted him.
Did you get that?
Yeah, no, I'll do it after.
1.
Well, there's only one hymn that would be on the top of the list for Vic, and that is Hugh Sherlock's hymn, Lord, thy church on earth is seeking thy renewal from above. Hugh Sherlock was a great man, and he was one of Vic's heroes. Vic was the first minister to be ordained in Panama, and Hugh Sherlock ordained him. When we were sent out to Panama, the mission house, in its wisdom, sent us to Jamaica to learn Spanish. Of course, they don't speak Spanish in Jamaica, but we got to meet Hugh Sherlock and his family, and Vic taught one of his daughters to pass her driving test. And after Vic had been ordained, Hugh used to come to Colon because there were problems in the churches in Panama. And on one of the visits, he'd been writing this hymn. And when he came to the mission house, he said, could he use Vic's typewriter? So he typed it out on Vic's typewriter and gave Vic the first copy, which he had dedicated to Vic and myself. So there is no other hymn that Vic would ever want other than Hugh Sherlock's hymn, Lord, thy church on earth. And that would be his favourite hymn. All right?
1.
I don't think the word greatest achievement really applies to Vic, because everything he seemed to touch, he touched it in the right way, and it enabled goodness to come out of it. There was no hierarchy of people. Nobody was more important than anybody else. If there was anybody in need, and he thought that there was a way of relieving that need, then he would give all his energy to doing it. As I've already said, the school and the old people's home and building of a new church, building the churches up in Panama, helping people with their British nationality, filling in the forms endlessly. When there were the riots in London, the church doors were opened. There were riots in Panama against the Americans. The children and I had to be whisked away to the British embassy, but Vic refused to go and stayed in the church with the church doors open because that's where the need was. IMCGB bringing the Pentecostal churches into the picture frame again, Melraw and race relations, all these things, but they were done by an ordinary person in an ordinary way, only because he cared for people and cared for everybody equally. He had no favourites. Nobody was more important than anybody else. When he was with anybody, they were the only person that was on his mind. He didn't come with a list, I'm in a hurry, I've got to go somewhere. He gave his whole attention to that person. So I think that an ordinary person getting to the level of everybody else and wanting to make the world a better place for everybody, that was his accomplishment.
1.
Vic always regarded the church as a family. And when you're in a family, sometimes things run smoothly, sometimes people get on, sometimes there are rows and arguments, But if the head of the house knows what is happening, then it's possible to pull things together. Obviously God is in charge, but God also chooses human beings, because we're all here together. And well, this is me talking, not Vic talking. I think the success is if we do regard it as a family with its strengths and weaknesses, and that there is a place for everybody. We're not always going to agree. For example, in Walworth, as time went on, the different nationalities coming there, and some feeling that they ought to be more in charge than others. And Vic's solution to that was to say, yes, everybody can have a society, but I will be the president of each society, so them to know that he was in charge and not them in the society. And that was the perfect answer to it. And there was no trouble at all, because they knew they were part of the family and that Vic was the head and the father of the family. It does mean that people have got to give and take. It does mean that you have to look at what you're doing, not look back, but look forward. And it means, well, this is me talking now, that the minister has to be available, which Vic was, 24 hours a day. And I know that's a simple thing to say, but a very difficult thing to do. But there has got to be someone who is available all the time. And that then, if it's regarded as a family, the parents are there all the time. If it's a church family, the parents are there all the time. Officers, ministers, everybody doing their best and pulling together whatever the differences are.
1.
We're all human beings. We all have our troughs and our high points. We all have things that we're grateful for. We all want more sometimes. We all feel that life has been hard for us. But we're in this all together. And I have been blessed by my own family as a child. I had polio when I was 3 months old, so I did more hopping than walking. But my mother always used to say, you're no different from anybody else, just do what you can. And I think that is the thing that has helped me to keep going. I am no different from anybody else. We all have these experiences. Obviously there are days for me now when 7 years, nearly 8 years without Vic, but his chair is there, and I talk to him in his chair, and I know that he's near to me. And I get phone calls from people who say, just thinking about Vic, so I'm just giving you a call. And yes, sometimes things are hard, but on the whole, no, they're not, because we all know that God cares for us and our dear ones are close to us. Yes, I am from Wales, which is known as the land of song, but there's always an exception to prove the rule, and I think that's me, one of them. My aunt was a music teacher, and she gave me music lessons, but I wasn't at all interested in them. I thought I could play the piano until I met Vic, and of course Vic could play piano organ. But I like singing, and I can sing a lot of wrong notes, but it's always nice to be with other people singing. And singing means a lot to me. We have tapes and records. The records can't be played now because I haven't got a record player, but there was always music in the house, and there's always music while I'm alone, and Vic is always very close to me now that I am alone when I put special music on. So it feeds the soul, it feeds the mind, and it extends out to other people. I'm able to go to concerts here in Manchester, to listen to the Manchester Orchestra. So yes, music is quite a big part in my life. And I give God thanks for Walworth Methodist Choir.
1.
How would I like Vic to be remembered? Well, that is a question that all of you who knew him will be able to answer, perhaps better than me. But he was an ordinary person with a big heart filled with love, who was prepared to give all his time, all his energy, all his worldly possessions for the good of others. He never wanted to keep anything for himself. He didn't neglect his family, I'm not saying that at all, because we all benefited from what he did. It all came back to us. But it was his generosity of spirit and his love of people, and I'm sure that that's what we will be remembered for, as well as his love of his music, because music was a big part of his life.
1.
Obviously Vic was in contact with the school and the old people's home, and instead of us having holidays every 3 or 4 years, he would go to Panama to see and just to be there. I still maintain contact, and people in this country are very generous in giving money and their prayers, and that is the most important thing that we can do, is to give a little of our money and give all our prayers for these things which were established by God's hand using a human being.
1.
Going to Panama again was under God's guidance. We had no intentions of going onto the mission field. Vic was still a probationer. We had to wait 7 years before we could get married, which was awful. That was the rule in those days. And then there was correspondence in the Methodist Recorder about the itinerant ministry. And Vic sent in his 2 penn'orth of a reply about the itinerant ministry. And he got a phone message back to say, does what you say mean that you are willing to go and serve overseas? So Vic's reply was, well, he hadn't carried it to that conclusion, but yes, as he thought it probably was. So then we were called to the mission house and told there were big problems in Panama, and would he go to Panama to sort the problems out. The good thing about it was that we were given permission to get married. So we got married sooner than we would have done and went to Panama to these problems. We didn't know what they were. But God again had a purpose, and very quickly, again because of his ordinariness, he related to everybody, and the mission house was empty when the day we arrived, and Mr. Williams, senior steward, had asked us several times as we were driven from the airport, haven't you got any other luggage? And we said no, just the 2 bags that we had. And we were supposed to have brought all sorts of household things from Britain. We didn't. So Mr. Williams went out, spoke to the members, and while we were sitting in the empty house, they came, one carrying a pillow, one bringing 2 cups, one bringing a saucepan, one bringing anything we needed. And so we had come empty-handed, and they, out of their poverty, were giving things to us. And that was the best way anybody could arrive anywhere. And it was that meant that everybody trusted him, everybody did what he wanted, what he asked. And we saw the need because there were children in the streets not going to school. So that's how the school came into being. There were elderly people. It was much more difficult to get help for the elderly people, but eventually through the World Council of Churches we did get a grant, and the old people's home is now 45 years old, and the school is 53 years old, and they're both doing extremely well. Still have even greater needs today than they did in our day, but God's hand is there, and that's how it started.
1.
Vic was not an extraordinary human being at all. He was just like all of us. He was my only husband, so I can't compare him with anybody else, but for me, obviously, he was the most perfect husband. Friends, he was loyal to everybody. And many people have said, whenever Vic spoke to them, he made them feel that they were the only important person in the world, whether it was somebody in high office or somebody the lowest of the low. When Vic was speaking to them, he gave them all his attention. So he wasn't extraordinary, he was ordinary. But because of his ordinariness, he was attracted to the people, for want of other words, at the bottom of the pile. If people were in need, he spent an awful lot of time with people filling in forms to get their status, their British citizenship, race relations. He gave his everything to race relations, starting Melrose and talking with the police and pouring oil on troubled waters, which people knew nothing about, but that's what he used to do. He was a friend to everybody in a very ordinary way, but an extraordinary friend.
1.
Answering a question about Vic's greatest accomplishment is well nigh impossible. He was brought up in a very small house in Manchester, 2 up, 2 down, toilet outside, just an ordinary place. He had a sister who was 5 years older than he was. He was the only child who passed the scholarship from the primary school to go to the grammar school. He went to the grammar school, wasn't really interested in scholarship at all, but one thing that kept him happy at the school was one of the teachers who was very keen on music and the orchestras that were here in Manchester. Vic's sister had piano lessons because, as I said, she was 5 years older than him, and he wanted piano lessons because this teacher encouraged him. So he went and had piano lessons for 18 months, and by then he'd had enough, but he was natural with music and played for the Sunday school, played in some of the church services, and but was not interested in education. When he did his GCSEs in those days, or whatever they were called, and he went to work, left school without any A-levels, and went to work in a shipping factory, in a shipping business near the Anglican Church in the centre of Manchester. And he chose that because the Anglican Church had organ recitals once a week, and he wanted to be able to go to the organ recitals. On his 18th birthday, he went, unbeknown to his parents, and signed to join the Navy. And he signed on to join the Navy for 25 years. Can you stop it now? It's very difficult with the time lag between today and those early years to describe what it was like those when we first went or came here to Walworth. We'd been in Panama, we'd been in Manchester, and we'd been in Paddington. And Vic had done a lot of work in all those places. Then he was asked to come and look at an empty church that was being insured for £3 million. So there was a lot of money being wasted, and the church doors were not open. Reverend Jimmy Butterworth had done fantastic work in the 20s and the 30s, but after the war things were difficult, and eventually the church doors were closed, and for 3 years nothing had happened. So how do you begin? Where do you start? It's no use asking the question because nobody's got an answer. And the first thing we had to do was to try and do some cleaning, because it had been not used and it was dirty. The manse wasn't in a very good state, so things were difficult. And the hostel in those days was known locally as the Walworth brothel. So there was really nothing going for us. And what do you do? Nobody could answer. You could ask the question, but nobody could answer. People would come to the door occasionally to ask what was going on tonight, and that led us to imagine what things had been going on. One particular night in November, I nearly didn't go and answer the door. Vic was out. He used to go out to walk around the area to get a feel of what it was like. He'd made contact with the council. He was concerned about conditions and race relations, so he had things in the community that he was trying to feel out. And I nearly didn't go and answer the door, but I did. And who was there but Esther Badu. And Esther timidly asked me, because obviously it wasn't an easy thing for her to come and knock on the door, where can you tell us where the Methodist church is? And I literally flung my arms around her, because that was the first time anybody had mentioned the Methodist church, and I said, it's here. And she came in and she told us that needed to have Baffour christened, and that's when Vic came back. He went round to see them, and the arrangements were made for the baptism to take place on the first Sunday in Advent, and that is when all the doors started opening. The baptismal party was about 50. People had wanted to come from Fernhead Road, but Vic had said no, you'd stay in your own church for have your service. So 2 carloads came from Fernhead Road. And in the meantime, we'd had a big poster put outside, all welcome to the service on that Sunday morning at 11:15. And about 34 people from the community walked in. Vic had 3 books, visitors' books, one for the baptismal party, one for Fernhead Road, and one for anybody else who might have come. And after that morning service, where he played the organ, because we didn't have an organist, fortunately he was an excellent organist, I led the service but did Vic the vital parts, and the children stood at the door handing out hymn books and guiding people. And after he'd had his lunch and a little sleep, he took the book with the names of the local people and went and visited them all, and came back not long before midnight. He was determined to see as many as he could. For the following Sunday, again we didn't know what was going to happen. All the people that had been there the Sunday before came back, bringing friends and family, because they were amazed that they'd gone to church and the minister had gone to their house that very same day. And he never did anything else for publicity. We didn't have any well-known preachers coming to preach. We didn't have big banners to say this is special. But he kept his visitors' book and asked people to write their names in, and he went to the home to see them, and that was the foundation of everything.
Well, that's very much like that's right. That's right. That's right. So, are you going to stand up? Undoubtedly, he was an incredible fundraiser and a man of immense networking skills, attracting celebrities and royalties alike. Can the modern day churches learn from this? I like you. Okay, all right. So you stick to my name. All right. Yeah, that's fine.
where we're standing now. This is the chapel where he must have preached when he was only in his early teens. He also used to live in the fields just over here. He was born and brought up there. He left there and went down into the town of Oswald, but this remained his boyhood chapel, and it's here that he first met people in the Methodist Church, and that set him off on his... Sorry, I'm going to have to start that again. I made a complete mess.
That's the point of the
Sorry.
Can you get in? You know, it's locked.
No.
You have to come close to me, yeah, so that you can be getting the voice. So if you stand here, I'm not getting you.
Don't get me.
No.
I prepared my answer before I realised we were going to be standing here.
Okay. Don't you hold on.
Yes.
Give me your dad and Anna your mother. I'll show you the architect of what you today know as Clubland. Can you tell me how this dream of Clubland came about and how it was nurtured?
The very beginning was here where we're standing now, at this little chapel on the moors above Oswald in Lancashire, where he first came into contact with the church, and where in fact he preached as a very, very young man, a boy even. He was known as the boy preacher locally. He even used to persuade his friends when he was 9 or 10 years old to get into the hen coops just over this wall here, and used to preach to them there to get practice inside a hen house. It was a passion that he had, and it never left him all his life. But your question was, what about Clubland? Well, Clubland, the inspiration for Clubland, I think, began in France during the First World War. He went out to France in 1916, and he was on the Somme briefly, but then he was found to be unfit for infantry duties and sent back to the town of Étampes, where he ran a YMCA hostel for invalided soldiers. And he ran activities for them, catered for them, and that, I think, was where his real passion for social work began. And when he finally got back to England in 1919, he went to Didsbury College to train for the ministry so that he could carry on that work. But there was a second inspiration that got him into this work, and that was when he was in Manchester. He started a club called a boys' club in a room above a pub, much to the concern of his principal at the time. And he ran that throughout the time he was a student and neglected his studies somewhat to do it. Those, I think, were his early influences. That's what inspired him to do his work that he did all his life.
You use this one, hand it on him, yeah?
Okay, so we can now go because we've done it for today.
Yeah,
Now
right.
go to the cemetery.
Okay, right. Well, we might have found a church.
I'll take this for you.
Yes, then I'll...
Okay. Now, careful. Take this one out, please. Right, so where this one was?
It was in a black bag.
Okay. Let it just be there for now.
Let me turn it off.
Okay, yes.
John, where are we now?
We're at Emmanuel Church, still in Oswald. We are about half a mile away from where JB grew up and where he preached his first sermons in the little chapel. He left Oswald Twistle in 1916, he went to France to fight in the trenches, and he never came back to here until, apart from visiting it, which he did many times, but he didn't come back here again permanently until he was buried in this church in 1977. So it has big memories.
Tell me when you're ready.
Yeah, go now.
John, where are we now?
We're in Emmanuel Church in Oswald Twistle. We're about half a mile from Green Howarth, where my father's little Methodist church up on the hill was, and where he grew up. Until he was 16, he lived here in Oswald Twistle. Then he went to France to fight in the trenches. He never returned here until 1977, when he was buried. He came back, obviously, to visit people many times, but he never returned after he left to go to France, and then to Didsbury Training College in Manchester, and then finally down to London to found Clubland.
Okay, could you tell me what was Clubland all about?
Clubland was all about giving young people of the district of Walworth, which was a very deprived area when he first came there in 1922, the same opportunities and the same aspirations, same self-esteem as you would expect from children who had the chance to go to public schools or to Oxford and Cambridge. He thought nothing was too good for the people of his community, and that's how he felt that's what he felt the job of Clubland to be. He wanted them to have the finest premises they could possibly have. He began in an almost derelict church, and the club started in what he called the dugouts after the name of the accommodation in the trenches. He called them the dugout clubs because they were underneath the old church. And very quickly he started renovating those, raising money for any way he possibly could, and he built a theatre and a gymnasium and a playground, a football playground, a proper theatre, a canteen, magnificent new church, and over the years he built that up. But it wasn't just about buildings, it was about the kind of activities he encouraged these young people to do. Not only sport, not only football and netball teams and camps and cycling out into the countryside, rambles at weekends, a lot of physical activity, but also mentally stimulating activities like debating. He had a parliament within the club, which was one of its central features, where the boys and girls learnt to debate and manage their own affairs. And then also the spiritual side. The church, his motto was body, mind and spirit, and each were equally important. They couldn't be done properly without the premises, but the premises were just what housed this amazing enterprise. That's what I think Clubland was all about, aspiration.
I'll get the sound, you have to speak aloud a bit. I'll get the sound, don't worry. The sound is coming.
I don't want it to sound like Nigeria films.
No. We'll get the sound. Just speak a bit louder, sir. Go.
John, why did Jimmy Butterworth have... Okay, cut. John, what inspired Jimmy Butterworth to work with young people and develop Clubland for their development?
In a word, his own incredibly poverty-stricken background. He came from an amazingly poor family. His father died when he was 12 under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and he had to go and work in one of the mills it was a bleach works, in fact, in Oswald Twistle. There were 5 children. They had 2 chairs in the house. The children stood to meals, and that was the kind of background he had, and he wanted to make sure that others did not have to have a similar deprivation. even if they had it in their own homes, and there were many people in Walworth at the time who were probably similarly poor as he had been, but he wanted them to have somewhere to go in the evenings, somewhere after work, because many of them began work very early, somewhere where they could meet, where they could be warm, where they could get together, do interesting, stimulating things that he was deprived of himself as a boy. So after he came back from France, after the war, and went to Didsbury College, as I've already said, he began a club in Beach Road in Manchester. His college principal was very impressed with his preaching and wanted him to go to a sort of middle class, very thriving church. There were two he was offered, two that he was invited to go to. One in the West Country, I believe, and one in St Anne's, not far from here. He refused them both. He said, I don't want to go to those. I want to stay here in Manchester and I want to run this boys' club in Beach Road. And his principal said, you can't. You've got to take one of these invitations that you got. And if you don't, the only other alternative is a really run-down church in Walworth in South London, a semi-derelict church with a population that has moved away, and there's nothing really for your talent as a preacher and so on. And he thought he was calling Jimmy's bluff. He thought that would persuade him to take one of these quite prestigious circuits to go to. But he said, right, I'll have Walworth. And so he went, and the rest is history.
What was his ultimate goal for the church and for the club?
His ultimate goal, I think it's fair to say, was in fact what he achieved by 1939. It was an extraordinary period from 1922, the building up from the dugouts through to opening the club with Queen Mary becoming its patron and attending the opening of the chapel in 1938. But as well as the opening, there was what was going on inside the club. There was 20 years of training young people, and to put in a word the answer to the question, what did he want to achieve? He wanted continuity. He wanted each generation of, some anyway, from each generation of members of the club to come back and serve the next generation, to become officers in the club. He called them officers, with, I think, perhaps a throwback to when he was in France in the army himself. The officers, and then there were captains like prefects in the club. There was a continuity all the way through, like you might have in a school or university, where the old scholars come back to help and to support it afterwards. And by 1939, this had happened. He had a very, very large body, not only of members, but also of ex-members coming back and doing 1, 2, or 3 nights a week. If they were doctors, helping in the medical capacity. If they were lawyers, giving advice. If they were actors, and he had plenty of those, came back to Clubland to help from the old Vic in Waterloo. It was an ongoing thing that he really wanted to establish. And by 1939, amazingly, he really had. It was an extraordinary place by then. And then came the Second World War.
Go on.
Having achieved his ultimate goal by 1939, and soon after the Second World War happened, and the premises were bombed, I'm sure it was a very difficult thing to comprehend for him. What was the feeling like, having to start all over again?
I wasn't there, but I know from what my mother told me that he was absolutely devastated by the destruction of the chapel. Incendiary bombs landed on it. They were trying to bomb the railway, which runs right past Clubland, and they set fire to the roof of the chapel, and the water mains had fractured also in the bombing, so they couldn't put the fire out, and it burnt to the ground. He used to say, when he was lecturing on the history of Clubland, 20 years' work destroyed in 20 seconds. But I think for him, even worse than that was the break in the continuity that I was talking about just now. He had trained up these members. He'd got this sort of rolling program where each generation was coming back to help the others and encouraging. Some of them were getting married there, and then their children being baptized there, being members, coming with their children to join, and that continuity had gone. A large proportion of his members almost immediately were in uniform. He was pretty much a pacifist himself by then because of the horrors he'd seen in France. And it was devastating, no other word for it. I mean, in many ways, he never recovered from it. He did pick up again after the war. He rebuilt the chapel. He rebuilt the parts of the club that had been damaged. He restored the membership. By 1955, he had 600 junior members and 100 senior members again, and flourishing activities. The club was pretty much back to what it had been before, but the continuity had been broken. He was starting again, and that was very hard to take. He'd lost also a lot of the helpers. There was still a very strong support in the 50s and 60s from voluntary supporters and ex-members, but it was never perhaps quite what it had been before. And the war changed many social attitudes anyway, and people were less willing to, I think, work for it in the sort of way that they had before the war. And he was getting older. But it was still an amazing achievement to pick up and start again. By that time I was a junior member in the club myself, and so I remember it from that point of view.
Undoubtedly, he was an incredible fundraiser and a man of immense networking skills, attracting celebrities and royalties alike. What can the modern day churches, learn from this?
What can anybody learn from this? He was a prodigious fundraiser. He had an amazing talent for it. I don't think he particularly liked it. It's something he had to grit his teeth and do. And he was quite candid sometimes about the people who he had to go to fundraise. He didn't always like them. He didn't find that their sort of business interests were always quite chimed with the sort of work that he was doing. But he also realized that you can't do these things. You can't have these sort of idealistic ideas, but not be able to back them with the cash. And the only way to do it was to perpetually fundraise. He went to America half a dozen times at least, once before the war and then several times afterwards. He was a talented gatecrasher. He could get into just about anywhere, partly because he was small enough to duck under turnstiles and things, but also because he could charm his way into almost any company. He charmed his way into Hollywood studios to ingratiate himself with Bob Hope, who became actually quite a close friend of his, and certainly an admirer, and came over here to do charity concerts in the Palladium and other theatres, and give all the money that it raised to Clubland. I suppose, to go to your question, what can the modern church learn from this? I suppose just that sometimes maybe you have to set to one side idealistic ideas and just get out there and raise the cash. It's not everybody's way, but it was something he felt he had to do to achieve what he wanted to achieve.
Could you tell me your personal experience of Clubland and why it was closed down in 1974 or around that time?
Well, first perhaps to correct your saying that it closed down. It never exactly closed down. It just came to a point where JB could no longer carry out the work he was doing. He had very few helpers left at the end, and a man of 80 in poor health cannot really run a youth club or a thriving church. And he probably stayed too long. He always used to say, "I will only leave here feet first," and he almost achieved that. And so it was rather sad to see the club in its last years, but it was for a very brief period. By 1974, 1975, it was still a going concern. So to your first question, what was it like growing up there? What was it like? What were my experiences of Clubland? Well, I was a junior member from the age of about 8, and then a senior member after that. And I was then a youth leader myself for a while, working for my father. For 1 year I did it full time, but then I went off to pursue a career in teaching. I taught in Peckham and in Brixton and came back and helped with the club in the evening, and it was a very stimulating part of my life. Sadly, I moved away, and so I wasn't there really when the club was winding down, and but my memories of it in 1975, when I last had an active role in the club, was that it was a thriving place. One very happy outcome was that the Freddie Mills Club joined around that time, and I understand that they are still an active section of the club, and I'm really pleased to hear that. They came while I was still there, and it was wonderful that Clubland was able to offer them, and great that they should ask, a great compliment that they should wish to be part of that enterprise.
What is your wish for Walworth Methodist Church Clubland, and how would you like your father to be remembered?
What would my wish be for Clubland? Well, in one sense, I suppose, to be honest, out of nostalgia, I would love to see it again thriving as a youth club like it did, but that's nostalgia. The real answer to the question is, I wish it well, and it seems to me that it is doing very well. And I'm sure my father, though the kind of work that Clubland, that Walworth and Clubland have done is different work, he would recognise and be the first to recognise that you can't just keep things as they are. You have to move on, you have to serve new needs. And what I see when I come down to Clubland, I couldn't wish really for any more for it. Your first question was, how would I like my father to be remembered? As a revolutionary, as a rebel, as someone who really turned things upside down, challenged authority, challenged orthodoxy, never let anybody get away with anything less than the best. He could be very difficult at times, very challenging, but you don't achieve the kind of things he did without having those qualities. And that's how I want to remember him. I'd also love a chance again to hear some of his wisdom about social matters, how to solve them. I think some of his kind of wisdom would be a great benefit today. Sadly, when I was younger, I didn't listen to what he had to say enough, but I think that's always the way it is. Young people think they know it, and it's only when they get older and they don't have the chance to talk to their parents again that they miss them and miss their wisdom. But I go back to my first answer. I'd like to remember him as the rebel and the revolutionary in social work that he was. He made a real difference, real change.
When Jimmy Butterworth retired from Clubland, where did he go?
He went very briefly to stay with my mother down in, who had a home down in Sussex, and then he was in hospital for a brief period, and he died in 1977. He was quite ill, both mentally and physically, and worn out with a lifetime of very strenuous work. And he came here to die. He died in hospital and came here to be buried. He had a service in Greenhouse Chapel up on the hill where we began these interviews earlier, and he came here to be buried in this graveyard.
So what hymn have you chosen today?
Now, Praise We Great and Famous Men, I think would be appropriate. But before I say that, when he was buried, the preacher who conducted the service said, we're going to finish with Jimmy's favourite hymn, and I think it was Now the Day Is Ended. But when we'd finished singing that, a little old lady who must have been well into her 90s piped up from one of the pews and said, that weren't Jim's favourite hymn. I remember his favourite hymn, it were such and such, and I can't remember what it was. And when we'd finished singing that, another person said, I don't think you're right about that, I think his favourite hymn were, and about half an hour later we were still singing hymns and trying to decide which was the real one. So I'm not saying this was his favourite, but I do think it's an appropriate one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.